probably 50-50 on that recession call, and that's a lot higher than most of the market is expecting right now, and equities are very exposed if that ends up being true.
Matt Gertken, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
The US president appears to be throwing his heft around to get trade deals done. India and Brazil, the latest in the firing line. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think it's right. There's a window for the president to increase leverage with an aggressive use of tariffs at the second half of this year. But he really needs to wrap up a lot of the trade war with some deals and remove uncertainty by the end of the year, because as we head into 2026, there's a midterm election to contend with, and Republicans don't want to see the big price rises hitting at the wrong time in November 2026. So he's got to get the hard work done now.
I've read the US-EU trade deal described as flimsy. Is it a real trade deal?
Yeah, it's interesting. The definition of trade agreements has really changed here. These are, in most cases, the deals that the Trump administration is negotiating are not ratified by legislatures. These are sort of like outline deals or framework deals. The countries will agree on things that they can agree on. They'll leave a whole bunch of other things completely unaccounted for, just loose ends dangling out there that everyone who's watching is well aware of. And they assume that they'll come back and get to those later. But the impression that it gives is that in many cases, especially with U.S. allies or partners that are reasonably close partners, the intention is not to spook the markets or scare anyone, and yet implement this policy that is, in fact, going to reduce productivity in the U.S., increase inflation a little bit, and weigh on foreign manufacturing. So it's not a pro-growth policy to be pretty obvious about it. But nevertheless, if you paint it right and you jawbone a little, maybe you can get the markets to swallow it. And that's especially the case during this AI enthusiasm that we're seeing in the marketplace. The Trump administration is so far able to get away with this tactic.
So that's the idea that the US economy is sailing along okay, so it doesn't matter what Trump throws at it, but that could stop working for him at some point, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And in fact, we're still at a pretty critical juncture for the US economy, even though in general it has been a resilient economy. The latest GDP numbers show that the real final sales to domestic purchasers were actually quite weak. And we see that many members of the Fed, we had a dissenting opinion at the Federal Reserve because at least two members thought that they should start easing policy already. And this is stemming from the fact that there has been a big drop in job openings, so there's a cooling in the labor market. And we also see the president's approval rating is quite weak. It's weakened a lot, and that's despite the fact that he passed his one big beautiful bill, his signature fiscal bill. He's been doing the trade war for 6-7 months. If he thought that was going to benefit him or cracking down on immigration, these things are not showing up in the approval rating. And his approval rating on the economy specifically is even a little worse than his general approval rating. So I think those things are sending the signals that especially on the low end of the American income ladder, people are hurting, and we've got a little bit of a mixed and unequal economy. But there are some serious risks, and that means that you could have the job market weaken further, and you could have tariff implementation start to really bite. And those two things could happen at the same time. And so I think that's a risk for the later part of this year.
And is that why Trump is applying so much pressure to the US Fed Chair Jerome Powell to lower interest rates?
Yes, the president has already fired off his best shot when it comes to legislation. The Congress really can't do much more than what they've just done. And there was some fiscal stimulus, but it's really not much. And then the other thing is that by removing tariffs or lowering the threatened tariffs, the president can maybe relieve some pressure there, although he's still overall increasing tariffs from where they were when he took office. And so what this means is that he doesn't have a lot of levers left. Deregulation, that's already been priced into the equity market. So we have had an easing in financial conditions because the business sentiment was positive toward the idea of deregulation and tax cuts. But all of this is now done, and the last lever that he might be able to move is the Fed. And the Fed will likely end up reducing interest rates, like we talked about, because the job market is cooling. And even Chairman Powell admits that that's probably going to be warranted, if not in September, then maybe at the end of the year. But the issue is that the administration is clearly feeling the heat because they know that some of these trade wars are going to be thorny, especially with China. And they also know that they are increasing the tariff rate and that that could have detrimental consequences. So trying to manipulate the Fed has become their tool right now. And the interesting thing is that the market handles it so badly that it doesn't really improve the situation. In fact, it can tighten financial conditions if he goes through with firing the chairman. So most likely Powell is out in May, but I think the key thing to remember is that the FOMC makes a majority decision. It's a committee. And also the Senate, in appointing a new Fed chair, makes a majority decision. And there's still moderate senators on the Republican side who will prevent someone from getting appointed who's not fit and credit worthy to hold that position. So we're not going to have a completely out of whack central bank, but there is some pressure here, and it's definitely going to continue.
Markets scaled back bets for a September cut on that less dovish tone from Powell. How are tariffs playing into this?
Yeah, there's been a whole debate about this, the question of whether the tariffs will be inflationary and whether it will be a one-off thing or whether it could actually feed into expectations. And there's the wait and see camp, which Powell is sort of in charge of. But there's also, this dissenting group, which is emerging and also sort of auditioning to replace Powell. And what they're saying is, well, look, we know that this is actually going to slow down growth. And we have other reasons to think growth may slow down as well. And so, we should start taking action on a forecast that unemployment has been too low for too long, quote unquote, and that it'll move up going forward, and therefore the Fed can move ahead of time. But that's not a majority view. And to be honest, when you consider Powell's position, a lot of chairmen would be in a situation where they would be hoping that they could get reappointed. In his case, it's very clear he won't be reappointed, which means that he has every incentive to die on his sword and defend the integrity of the institution and actually fight for a tighter monetary policy, given that the unemployment rate is still technically a little bit lower, than the neutral rate and of unemployment, and also that you have you still have inflation that's moving up, and the one-year CPI swap implies that inflation can go up a lot over the next year.
Well, Australia is heading toward its rates decision on the 12th of August. How is Australia placed in all of this?
Well, I think a key thing for Australia is always to look at the Chinese economy, and what's happening there is still a deeply entrenched deflation. And while there are some signs that maybe it could be starting to stabilize and that the government policy is starting to shift, including criticism, rumors of criticism within the inner sanctum of the Communist Party because Xi Jinping's economic policy has been such a failure. These things could culminate in a much more accommodative fiscal policy. We're clearly seeing more accommodative monetary policy. And meanwhile, there is a willingness, apparently, to negotiate a trade deal with the United States, or at least not to escalate to the maximum. And so these things could lead to a stabilization. But to be honest, I'm still quite pessimistic about the state of China. This is just a massive misallocation of resources that we've had over the past 2 decades, and a massive property bubble that's bursting. It's weighing on consumers, and we see that in their willingness to lend and their willingness to borrow and their willingness to spend. And so I think actually that deeply entrenched deflation in China is an ongoing problem. They're overproducing goods. They're provoking protectionism abroad. And probably Australia is probably the central bank is correct to be quite cautious and maybe erring on the side of being a little bit easier in monetary policy than maybe some would argue that they should be.
What are you expecting from markets on the 1st of August? Will we see Liberation Day Mark II?
Well, it won't be as big of a shock because we have some significant exceptions this time around. We have, first of all, Canada and Mexico, of course, make up about a third of the US's imports, and they have the USMCA trade deal, which does need to be renegotiated, which is going to be a problem. And of course, there are tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and they could go up, to 35% even. But a lot of them are exempt. And meanwhile, the UK, Japan, the EU, they have gotten a lower tariff rate, although it's still very high when you really think about the move, from almost 0 to 15%. But South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, a lot of deals have been done, and a lot of uncertainty from that side has been removed. And so what that means is that a number of countries will get hit hard on August 1st, but they don't necessarily account for a large share of American trade. And what it could do then is create this bifurcation where we see a global shock. It's not as big as what was threatened in April, but it does affect a number of economies around the world. We see global trade suffer a hit and weaken. The U.S. economy may sustain it a little bit better than people expected, and that depends on that whole story we were talking about the domestic consumer in the U.S. But basically, it could force several other countries to come to the negotiating table. Brazil's a good example. Things have been going badly. They have very high tariff rates that are coming in, but they have an election next October. They might need to do an about face and go ahead and do what the EU did and swallow their pride and try to negotiate a deal.
You flagged it's going to be a weak second half of the year in the US. How should investors be approaching this?
Yeah, I think, well, for one, the investment in the US in artificial intelligence, both on the hard side, the data centers, but also actually just the pouring into these companies that are trying to develop models of billions of dollars. This is really a major driver, in addition to the fact that the high end of the income ladder is still doing pretty well and still spending reasonably, although, again, the consumption contribution to GDP in Q2 really wasn't that great. But the point I'm making is that, something that's a threat to AI can definitely shake up the markets. If the capex falls short on that side, that can have a devastating impact in this environment. But also just the labor market, like we talked about. If the difficulty of getting a job spreads from the youngest people who are entering the market, then it starts to go to more lower skilled workers, and we start seeing broader swaths of the labor market affected. Traditionally, when the unemployment rate rises much higher than it is now, then we start to see a trend take hold where people just aren't spending as much, and that has knock-on effects, and it would engender layoffs, and then that would engender less spending. And so that would be a recessionary development, and it is a risk. A lot of people have downgraded that risk, but the labor market is the thing to watch, and that's what Jerome Powell said today.
What probability are you placing on a US recession materializing?
We're still sort of thinking 50-50. I mean, we've probably been a more cautious than others on this issue. We saw a lot of those, again, that big drop in job openings and the fact that jobs plentiful relative to jobs hard to get in the surveys really started to fall. And that typically implies a move upward in the unemployment rate, which also historically the unemployment rate doesn't stay low for very long. And it has started moving up. And take a look at those young people fresh out of college. The unemployment rate there is really skyrocketing. So there are these signs of weakness, but nevertheless, there's also signs of resilience, and that's what's won over the minds of investors so far this year. So again, we just have to see whether this spreads. Tariffs alone have been focused on too much. It does have a lot to do with real incomes. And if the inflation rate goes up by 1.5 percentage points, and yet we don't get an improvement in income growth, then of course that means real incomes are falling, and that means that spending is going to go down, and the economy is going to start to slow. So probably 50-50 on that recession call, and that's a lot higher than most of the market is expecting right now. And equities are very exposed if that ends up being true.
Matt Gertken, thank you.
Thank you so much. So much of a pleasure to join.